And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the very first Fresh Take Friday breakfast event of 2020, not only the semester. I'm Deandra Rose. I am Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics here at Duke and Sanford, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this morning's discussion. And on behalf of the Polis Director, Mac McCorkle, Associate Director, BJ Rudell, and Program Coordinator, Anna Kinnear, welcome. We have the privilege of having an expert on North Carolina politics, on history, on voter rights and suppression with us this morning, Professor Bob Korstad. And to give you a little bit of information about Professor Korstad, he's Professor of Public Policy and History here at Sanford and Duke University. He's also a Bass Fellow. He received his BA and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research interests include 20th century U.S. history, labor history, African American history, and contemporary social policy. And he's the Associate Director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. His publications include many books, including the To Right These Wrongs, the North Carolina Fund, and the Battle to End Poverty and Inequality in the 1960s in America, Civil Rights Unionism, Tobacco Workers, and the Struggle for Democracy in the Mid-20th Century South, Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Talk About Life in the Segregated South, and Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World. So please join me in welcoming Professor Korstad.
Thanks, Deandra and Anna and BJ, and all of you for getting here on Friday morning. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this book. So I'm going to talk about a new book that I'm just in the process of finishing up with a colleague at UNC, Jim Lalutis, who was in history in the PhD program at Chapel Hill with me, and who I've written quite a bit with, including the book that Deandra mentioned on the war on poverty in North Carolina, which was about a program that Terry Sanford created when he was governor of North Carolina. It was the anti-poverty program. This book is entitled tentatively Fragile Democracy, Citizenship, Race, and Voting Rights in an American State. And hopefully it'll be out late summer in time for the elections. And I'm going to just give you just a little bit of background on how we got going on this. Then I want to, in the interest of time, just read the introduction, which I wouldn't normally do, but it'll be a lot faster. And then I want to leave us with a question that we can talk about, and I'll give you the question before I do my introduction, so you can be thinking about how all that fits together. This book grew out of a report and expert testimony that Jim did in the NAACP's challenge to House Bill 589, which is a very massive reworking of North Carolina election law that was passed by the Republican-controlled General Assembly of North Carolina in 2013. It was challenged very quickly by a lot of parties, including the NAACP, who we work for, but also Common Cause, the ACLU, and the Justice Department. The lawsuits were, for the most part, successful. Virtually all of the bill, all the provisions of the bill got thrown out by the Fourth Circuit Court. And in the aftermath of that, the still Republican-controlled General Assembly 2018, put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, trying to at least trying to keep the voter ID live. It's something that the voters passed. General Assembly enacted about a little over a year ago. That too is being contested right now. A federal court, one federal court judge has actually put a hold on it. I've forgotten what exactly the legal term is, but it's not going to be, these voter IDs not going to be used in the primary elections this year, and then there'll be a case this summer. So Jim and I spent the summer revising and updating our report to include everything that happened since the last time that we did this. And so there's a lot been going on, and I'll tell you a little bit about the bill itself and the kind of context for it. And then what I want to do at the end, after I've kind of laid out kind of a larger argument about voter suppression and voter rights in North Carolina, is talk about why and how this particular bill came to be. Why in 2013, almost 50 years after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, why we had this pretty extreme effort at voter suppression. And so that's the question we'll talk about. Now, just one thing to be clear: I'm a historian, not a political scientist or a specialist. I don't do election surveys, and I'm not a quantitative historian, so I'm not looking at. I'm trying to look at some of the broader historical issues that are tied up with this change in election law. So let me just go through this introduction really quickly, because I think it'll lay out the issues and the kind of interpretation we're trying to develop. So America is at war with itself over the right to vote, or more precisely over the question of who gets to exercise that right and under what circumstances. Conservatives speak in tones of America the vulnerable, warning that voter fraud has become so widespread that it threatens public trust in elected government. They insist that lawmakers act at once to reverse the damage by policing voter registration more vigorously and implementing new security measures such as photo ID requirements for access to the ballot box. Progressives countered that election fraud is rare, and that when it does occur, it more often involves politicians' misdeeds, which we've seen a lot of in North Carolina, or mistakes by election officials, rather than wrongdoing by individuals, people voting when they don't legally have the right to do that. From this perspective, efforts to change the ways we govern elections are at best a solution in search of a problem. At worst, they constitute a thinly veiled campaign to shrink the electorate and restrict some citizens' right to cast a free and fair ballot. And over the last decade, North Carolina has become a battleground for this state. I would say the most important battleground in the country. In 2010, riding a wave of voter discontent, Republicans gained control of both houses of North Carolina's General Assembly. The completion of the decennial census in that same year gave them the opportunity to withdraw legislative districts in ways that produced a Republican supermajority in the General Assembly. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court, ruling in the landmark case Shelby County versus Holder, struck down Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That section required federal approval of changes to election law in jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination. And that included 40 counties in North Carolina and most of the rest of the southern states. Now that Section 5 was really critical in protecting the voting rights of minority citizens. And within a month of the Shelby decision, Republican the legislature passed House Bill 589, the most comprehensive revision of election law in the nation. The new law required that voters provide photo ID at the polls. It shortened the period for early voting, ended same-day voter registration, and out-of-precinct voting, all of which had a disproportionate impact on minority, low-income, and elderly voters. Now, opposition to these changes was vocal and well-organized. It found voice through what became known as the Moral Monday movement, named for the weekly gatherings of protesters outside the legislative building in Raleigh. Reverend William J. Barber, who has been teaching for us here at the Sanford School, a charismatic Pentecostal minister from Goldsboro, North Carolina, and president of the state chapter of the NAACP, spearheaded this movement. For nearly a decade before that, he had led the North Carolina People's Assembly, which is an ecumenical and multiracial coalition of organizations that had pressured lawmakers, Democrats as well as Republican, and it's a very nonpartisan. It was a very nonpartisan movement to act on a whole variety of social welfare issues, from affordable housing, a living wage, to criminal justice reform, to improvements in health care and education. The More Monday movement brought tens of thousands of new participants to this campaign that had been ongoing for that previous decade. They marched in Raleigh and in cities all over North Carolina to express their opposition primarily to House Bill 589, but also to the General Assembly's larger public policy agenda, which included, and this is really important for our discussion, reductions in spending for public education, new limits on unemployment insurance, elimination of the state's earned income tax credit for low-wage workers, the refusal of federal funds for the expansion of Medicaid, and the rollback of death penalty reform, just to name a few of their policy proposals. Now, while protesters gathered in the streets and filled the halls of the General Assembly, attorneys representing the state chapter of the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, the League of Women Voters, and the U.S. Department of Justice challenged, as I said, HB 589. They argued that if left to stand, the law would, quote, cause the denial, dilution, and abridgment of African Americans' right to vote, an effect that would in turn discount the voices of other citizens who allied themselves with black voters on issues of governance and public policy. So it's, the argument here is it's not just a diminution of the rights of African Americans, but also of the biracial members of the biracial coalition that had been developing in the state. Democracy itself, the opponents argued, was at stake in the battle over House Bill 589. Now, as historians and participants in these events, Jim and I shared another observer, a former member of the faculty in the law school here, that the politics of today is continuous with the past that made it, marked by struggles that have never really ended, only ebbed, shifted, and returned. So to understand these issues at stake in today's battle over the ballot box, we must look back to 1865 and the end of the Civil War. The Union had been preserved and the Confederacy was in ashes, but the sacrifice of nearly 750,000 lives had not decided the Republic's future. Would there be, quote, a new birth of freedom, as Republican President Abraham Lincoln argued or imagined in his Gettysburg Address, or would the nation be reconstituted as a white man's government, the outcome championed by his successor, Democrat Andrew Johnson? So between 1865 and 1870, Lincoln's party answered that question with 3 constitutional amendments that historian Eric Foner has described as America's second founding. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and guaranteed the liberty of 4 million black men, women, and children who'd been enslaved in the South before that. The 14th Amendment granted them citizenship by birthright, something that is being contested again today, and established the equal protection of the law, principle of equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment forbade the states from denying or abridging male citizens' right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, these constitutional guarantees tied the fate of American democracy, we're arguing in this book, to the citizenship rights of a newly emancipated black minority and their descendants. For 150 years, the exercise of those rights and the connections between racial justice and democratic governance have been centermost issues in American politics, or the centermost issues in American politics. And this has been particularly true for the right to vote. In North Carolina and the nation, battles over the franchise have played out through cycles of emancipatory politics and conservative entrenchment. And this is a kind of key argument that we're trying to make in this book. In a pattern repeated multiple times, blacks and their allies have formed political movements to end racial discrimination and claim their rights as equal citizens. They've done so not only to advance their own interests, but to promote participatory democracy more generally and to make government responsive to the needs of all of its people. Invariably, these efforts have met resistance from conservative lawmakers who have erected barriers around the ballot box. Now, conservatives, and this is one of the things that we discovered in the process of doing this project, have been remarkably creative in that work over the last 150 plus years. When one restriction was struck down by the courts, and this is particularly in the period after World War II, or through protest or political mobilization in some other form, they quickly invented another. Sometimes they spoke in overtly racial terms and implemented these reforms through violent means, like the 1898 coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a subject of a recent book. At other times, they cast franchise restrictions in more euphemistic language of fraud and corruption. Always they presented the strict regulation of the right to vote as a means of ensuring what they called good order and good government. Now, some pundits have described or suggested that the battle over the ballot represents little more than competition between Democrats and Republicans to reshape the electorate and gain partisan advantage. And there's no doubt that the contests have been very intensely partisan. But the ideological realignment of the Democratic and Republican parties remind us that something far more significant has been at stake. In the decades immediately following the Civil War, conservatives called themselves Democrats. They campaigned for limited social provision and conspired to deny black men the right to vote, while Republicans, identified as social progressives, championed an expansive and generous state and fought for equality at the ballot box. Beginning in the mid-20th century, these positions flipped. Grassroots activists and national leaders reshaped the Democratic Party to support the advancement of civil rights. And Republicans aligned themselves as advocates for small government, limited federal involvement in state and local affairs, and a restrictive stance towards citizenship and its attendant rights. Through all these changes, the core issues have remained the same, we argue. Racial equality and the right of all citizens to participate fully in a democratic society. When racial equality has been denied and when race has been used for partisan gain, or as a mechanism for exclusion from the democratic polity, the result has been a society in which vast numbers of its citizens, not only racial minorities, have had their right to fair and effective representation compromised. Understood in this historical context, today's arguments over voting rights are reminders that we live in a time every bit as consequential as the first flush of reform that followed the Civil War. Then as now, democracy was imperiled by divisive racial appeals, violent expressions of white supremacy, and efforts to roll back newly won citizenship rights. In such a moment, history has a clarifying power. Knowing the past can help us discern the present and shape a future true to our nation's most sacred democratic values. So that's the introduction. Let me just sketch out a little bit of where the book goes. So we start, in the aftermath of the Civil War. We go on in the book to trace the cycles of emancipatory politics and conservative retrenchment from radical Reconstruction through the Fusion movement in North Carolina, which was a biracial coalition of populists and Republicans, and then the white supremacy campaign at the turn of the century. And that's kind of a chapter that we look at, and kind of, I think it's titled something like the long period of Reconstruction. And then we, in turn, at the end of that chapter, to disfranchisement, which basically took the vote away from the vast majority of male voters, primarily using the literacy clause, which required people to pass literacy tests, but also constricted the rights of poor white voters too. So in 1895 or something, 85% of black men, eligible black men, voted in North Carolina. By 1905, it's like 3 or 4%, maybe a little bit more than that. And the total population of eligible men decreased to something like from 70s and 80% down into 30% in the 19-teens. The next chapter looks at the long years of Jim Crow that followed the battles of the turn of the century, and looks at a couple important things. One is the enfranchisement of women with the 19th Amendment, which we've been celebrating this past year, and also at the beginnings of, in the 1930s, of the turn of African American voters in North Carolina away from the party of Lincoln, which had become a kind of an all-white party in North Carolina, to the New Deal and to the Democratic Party, and really made the decision to fight for voting rights within the context of the Democratic Party, not as a third party or not within the Republican Party. The next chapter looks at let's see. The next chapter looks at the battles that start after World War II on the part of African Americans to regain the vote, and we've got a really lengthy chapter on the period what we call in the forgotten 1950s, in which we've done a lot of work in the legislative records, looking at the ways black voters, particularly in small towns across North Carolina, start using what power they have, the power of the courts, the power of protest to regain the right to vote bit by bit, and also the way in which at every turn conservative Democratic legislators work to constrain that kind of vote. Then we look at the period of the 1960s up to the 1990s. So with the Civil Rights Movement, the passage of the legislation on voting, the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but most importantly, start looking at the reconfiguration of the Democratic Party. And the kind of the Republican Party too, and the kind of movement of white conservative Democrats out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and the kind of which becomes the home of this kind of conservative movement that really has long roots. And we end that chapter with something we'll talk a little bit more about. With the really coming to power of a kind of moderate to progressive Democratic Party under former Governor Jim Hunt in the 1990s, the expansion of social welfare programs, particularly around education, early childhood education, but a whole lot of other issues. And also then starting in 1995 and really continuing up to President Obama's victory, the effort to try to make voting easier and expanding opportunities for people to vote. So things like early voting, voting out of precincts, same-day registration, all of these were reforms that were put in place in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then the last chapter, and that's what I want us to talk a little bit about, is the emergence in the wake of President Obama's election in 2008 of this kind of, again, another wave of conservative backlash, and which ultimately brings the Republican Party back into power in North Carolina, and the effort to again use legislation and eventually constitutional amendments to put restraints on the right to vote, and that had particular consequences for an increasingly Latino population in North Carolina, African American voters, youth voters, elderly voters, and low-income voters. So that's kind of the trajectory of the book, and I guess the question I have for us to talk about is how and why in 2013 would we would the General Assembly have passed a set of incredibly restrictive, or at least I would argue, they might not argue the same thing, laws to make voting more difficult and kind of constrict in a variety of different ways the population. So I'll tell you, I mean, there are a whole lot of different things that we could talk about, and how these kinds of waves of progress and backlash happen. But one that I just mentioned before that I think is really important to understand, and I think that most people have missed, is that the period from, say, 1990 to Obama's election 2008 was a period of incredible expansion of democracy in North Carolina, I would say. And that includes all of the provisions that we talked about in terms of voting, but also the expansion of the role of government in promoting all kinds of social welfare programs that benefit a larger part of the population. So one of the arguments, why this is important, is one of the arguments here is that, it's not that conservatives don't like black people to vote because they're black people, or they don't like Latinos to vote because they're Latinos. They don't like those people to vote because they, when they get political power, or when they're able to build alliances with progressive whites, they have a political agenda and a policy agenda very much at odds with the kind of small government, low taxation, limited regulation that conservatives have. So, I would argue that one of the things we're seeing in the context of 2013 is really a backlash against this kind of whole kind of long period, 20 to 25 year period of expansion of the vote and expansion of social welfare provisions. But let me just throw it open for either big questions or general questions, or if you've got thoughts about how this kind of analysis might help us understand where we are today or what's going on today. So thank y'all. Yes. Two unrelated questions. Unrelated to what I'm saying, or unrelated to each other? Okay.
But I thought if the topic sentence would not surprise you with my question. One is about Native American voters and how what we're hearing is that they aren't being allowed to vote because they have P.O. boxes.
Right.
And I was wondering if you would talk about that, and then I would like you to talk about the Stacey Abrams effect in Georgia. Unrelated, but
yeah.
all related.
Yeah, I don't know much about either one, so I'll, so maybe other people do. I think the Native American vote is a really interesting and that's one aspect of it is people with, without kind of typical home addresses in kind of rural areas where you don't have roads and the kind of infrastructure systems we have here. So, P.O. boxes are not, they don't count as a home address that you can use. And there are a lot of other forms of voter repression among Native peoples too. If you look I was looking at some of the voting in Robeson County, which is the kind of center of the Lumbee people. Voter participation, voter registration among Native Americans there is really kind of unbelievably low, and there's a long history of kind of violence and extra-legal violence there. What exactly you mean about the Stacey Abrams effect?
Well, the whole purge that happened.
Oh.
And the person who's not Stacey Abrams.
Right.
became governor.
Right. Yeah, so that's a traditional tactic of conservatives is to, at various times, purge the registration books, and that's what they're doing there. So it means if I've lived in Chapel Hill most of my life. I've been a registered voter there for at least 40 years. I registered one time 40 years ago. I've been voting pretty much at the same precinct, for at least 30 years. If I had to go, every 5 years or at any time during that period, if they just purge the voter registration books, which means that nobody you have to re-register to vote, everybody. Okay? Well, just think about the time and the energy it took. Think about the fights and the battles that it took for people to get registered to vote to start with, and just the energy and effort it takes to do that today. None of this is particularly new. I think Alabama is probably the worst place, as they've shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in many counties, or they're open. The place where you can go register to vote is open twice a week. During the day. On a Thursday from 2 to 3 or 4 to 5 or something. When people can't do it. So there are all kinds of different ways to limit people's access to the ballot. But there's also a lot of ways, even once people get the ballot, to limit their ability to elect people that represent them, people that, and so that's a lot of what this fight has been about. Eric.
Fascinating. I always enjoy your work. And I was just thinking about this question that you pose about kind of race versus policy, right? That it's not just that Republicans don't like blacks, but there's policy outcomes they're seeking. And that's no doubt true, particularly if you look at the attack on student voting, right? So it's not just blacks are going after, but student voting, the things students need to know, and DJ knows this well, having led the efforts at Duke on student voting, is that from 2014 to 2018, college student voting doubled in the midterm elections, about 20% to 40%, Duke right in there.
Right.
So we have an amazing resurgence in student voting, despite efforts
Right.
to limit it. But I wonder if we're at a different place now because of Trump and the racialized politics that he's brought to the forefront.
Right.
His emergence as a politician was all around race.
Right.
When he went after the Central Park Five,
Right.
Called for the death penalty, and now we know they were falsely accused.
Right.
And his real emergence was around birther.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
A pure racial
Right.
emergence. So I just
Yeah.
wonder if we're at a point now where the suppression of voting both or more racialized,
Yeah.
or I don't know.
Well, no, I think that's true, and that's obviously that's an issue that gets used a lot. So in the late 19th century in North Carolina, conservative Democrats raised the kind of specter of Negro rule. That somehow blacks were getting into office, they were voting, they were going to take over state government. One of the, kind of race and racism has been used systematically throughout the last 150 years or so in North Carolina and around the country. So what is all that about? Well, I mean, in terms of today, in terms of Trump, and this is some stuff we deal with in the conclusion, which I started to read but decided not to. There certainly is this kind of resurgence of racial animosity. It has a lot to do with the election of a black president, which I think freaked a lot of people out, and also was a great rallying cry for conservatives. In their appeals to people who, in the context of the demographic changes that are going on in the United States, are very apprehensive about what the future looks like. I mean, if the predictions of a minority majority, whatever that means, are true, kind of traditional white voters and white political elites are in trouble. And so I think that these kind of racial appeals, whether it's around birtherism or kind of around Obama more generally, or in North Carolina, and this is one of the things we had to do a lot of with this, just in doing these revisions with the increase in the number of Hispanic voters, is just the way in which now, a lot of this voter fraud is about these undocumented people who are coming and voting. Not only are they stealing or getting social welfare benefits that they're not entitled to, they're not citizens, but now they're going and they're surreptitiously, going and voting as people who are dead. They're finding the names and social security numbers. Like, that's what people. You can't get 50% of the people to the polls when they're allowed to go to vote. This idea that you're going to, there's going to be this whole horde of people who want to go out and do that. So I think it fits into that. It's a way of trying to, but I also think, and this has been really important, is that these progressive moments that I'm talking about, this kind of emancipatory politics, are, at least in North Carolina, always biracial, or at least multiracial. Okay. They, liberal Democrats, in the late 19th century, farmers who were in the Populist Party and black Republicans, they ran, in 1892, the Populists ran a slate of candidates. Conservative Democrats who were in power ran a slate of candidates. And the Republican Party, which was most largely African American, ran a slate of candidates. Well, the Democrats won quite easily, and the Republicans and the looked at each other and said, "This is stupid. If we run against each other, we have no chance of taking political power. But if we create a fusion, or we run, we run candidates that we support together, it was a complicated process. We have the chances of winning." And in fact, by 1896 and 1894 and 1896, they were actually able to win. So what's critical here, and this is why race and racism and kind of this kind of racial animosity is so important, is it's necessary to break up the kind of coalitions that really challenge conservative power in North Carolina, and that was true, and that's been true today. If you look at all these voting rights changes and the social welfare changes that I talked about, those are all things that are coalitions, sometimes including kind of moderate Republicans, that are being put in place by the Democratic Party, that is increasingly made up of more women, progressive whites, and African Americans. And so, you know, that, again, racism is you know, it's a strategy as much as an ideology. And I wouldn't, you know, I don't mean to dismiss the kind of racial, the kind of racism and kind of belief in white supremacy that's there, that is very much focused on, you know, kind of arguing that, and particularly this was true up until, say, the Civil Rights Movement, you know, that somehow black people weren't entitled to vote because they weren't prepared for the responsibilities of citizenship. And that has a long history too. Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about the ordinance of people being convicted of felons not being able to vote? Was that part of any kind of, you know, voter suppression campaign, or what?
That hasn't been a big issue in North Carolina. I mean, it has been in other parts of the country, but I mean, I think I'm not even sure I know what the law is on that. I think probably felons can't vote in North Carolina, but I'm not even sure about that. That's something I need to look up. It hasn't been as much of an issue in this state. Yep.
So we know that voter fraud is virtually non-existent, right? And that's kind of the central argument that conservatives have made among the public and the media to kind of convince, to push the public opinion towards that argument. But Democrats have largely said, you know, this is a struggle of voter rights, and they've kind of like lost, I think, that framing battle in the general public. So what do you think Democrats or just challengers of these types of challenges to voter rights can do in terms of like political framing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. This whole issue of voter fraud came out, in a sense, came out of nowhere in North Carolina. In 2008, as soon as Obama was elected, the John Locke Foundation, Civitas, whole think tank of conservative groups in North Carolina that's funded by Art Pope, started just running all these articles about voter fraud. And this was happening all over the country, okay? And it was part of a fairly well-coordinated effort on the part of national conservative organizations to start raising some issues that would kind of get the public to think that there's something illegitimate about Obama's election. And so what is it, how are we going to frame that issue? And so this whole question of voter fraud, there are all these people voting who, you know, they're not citizens, or they're people who are just out stuffing the ballot box. And it's, you know, I think the Democrats have had a very difficult time trying to think about a strategy of, you know, a kind of a way of challenging that. And that, you know, people say, well, and here's one of the ways they do it, you know, say, well, you need you know, and these are ads for the constitutional amendment. Well, you need a photo ID to go to an R-rated television or movie. You need a photo ID to get on an airplane. You need a photo ID to use a credit card. And they're running all these kind of ads. That's all wrong. You don't need a photo ID to go to an R-rated movie. You can I mean, I've done it. You can get on an airplane without a photo ID if you have other forms of identification, and they do a security check on it. You might miss your flight. It might take you a while, but that's not actually right. None of the credit card companies require a photo ID to use your credit card. Visa or MasterCard, one of the others, requires a photo ID if you get money at a bank with your ID. You know, I don't know what the other ones are. I mean, there's they try to make this thing a kind of a common sense issue. You know, we all have to have voter IDs. We have to have this all over. You know, without and the argument that another one of our faculty colleagues, John Hood, who teaches here occasionally, I think, argues, well, if it just catches, what's wrong with it? If it just catches one person who is trying to vote illegally, then that's great. Okay, so why don't we have this kind of safety valve here? Well, and that's the argument that the lawyers are making. I mean, we've got all the statistics about, who has voter IDs, who has access to them. I mean, there's all kind of evidence, but that evidence kind of flies in the face of this common sense, and also just the massive kind of public relations campaign that's gone up around that, and the quite literally millions of dollars that were used for that campaign. Yeah.
I think you're really onto something in what you said. It made me think of something you said a couple minutes ago. Try and paraphrase exactly what you said. You said that if you have a minority majority in the country, that traditional conservative voters, people like the white voters, are in trouble. And then you stop.
Uh-huh.
And when I heard that, I thought, in trouble for what? And if you're a casual voter, you think, oh, I'm in trouble. What's the trouble going to be? And I think if you're a progressively minded person, you have shorthand also, the way we speak, and we say, well, they'll be in trouble. What we really mean is that we'll have more representation, there'll be more people of color and more women, in elected office. But when you're listening to other news sources, you hear you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You also said that.
You're right.
And they're not in trouble. There is no trouble to be had.
Right.
It isn't the end of the world.
Right.
People of different color or women in office. It turns out it works out pretty well. They put their pants on one way or the other.
Right.
And for these conservative groups you're talking about, they sit down and don't say, how do we make the country better? They say, how do we win the argument?
Right.
And that's a different question they're asking. And people who are progressively minded aren't asking that question in the same way.
Yeah.
I just think you're really onto something.
Yeah, well,
You're part of this, and we're going with the topic.
Yeah, well, I think when I say, they're in trouble, I mean, the relatively small group of elites who benefit from these policies are the ones who are, kind of pulling the strings on, on the elections and the kind of appeals that people are making. So, if you look at Art Pope, I mean, he has a political agenda and the kind of political beliefs, which are fine. I mean, they're very much a part of American tradition that sees government as from his perspective, government should be something that protects his rights, protects his property. Is not something that's there to kind of more generally distribute the kind of social pie or the kind of the wealth of the society in a way that benefits large numbers of people. And again, I think that one of the things we're trying to argue here is that there are fundamental differences about people's perception of the role of the state, the role of who counts as a citizen. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a little bit in here, because the General Assembly does all of this stuff around sexuality and women's rights, and so and a lot of this discussion of voting is, when you put it together with that, is a kind of a questioning of who is a citizen, okay. Who has rights as a citizens, and what are the rights that citizens have in a democracy? And those have been contested issues for the entire history of the United States, and there's nothing new about that. Yeah, okay. Here, yeah.
I'm going to go back to the question that you started with about birth from what happened between 2000
Right.
roads. And to the extent that people who lost those jobs were white men or boys in high school who expected, or girls in high school expected to go into those jobs in the middle school, the sense of the government is worrying about other people, they're not worrying about me.
Right.
I think that's what the Democrats also lost.
Right.
Not just in North Carolina, but lots of other places.
Yeah.
But I think that speaks to your
Yeah.
question about what happened
Yeah.
that by 2010.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the kind of decisive issues in North Carolina is you had a lot of discontent on the part of large number of North Carolinians who'd lost their jobs, who had seen the kind of globalization take tobacco industry, furniture industry, textile industry, apparel industry. I mean, the things that kind of working class and middle class North Carolinians had depended on for years had all of that taken away, and that created this kind of an environment or a kind of vacuum in which other appeals or figuring out who to blame for that. And the other thing is the Democratic Party in North Carolina was, didn't have very good leadership. I mean, a two-term governor is, pled guilty to a felon for misusing, I think, campaign funds. I mean, a lot of this was kind of an opportunity that was there for Republicans to take. So I think it really, when you try to explain how did the Republicans take control in 2010, there are a whole lot of factors that you have to take into account, including a certain amount of disillusionment among North Carolina voters. BJ? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very biased question, so I know you'll give a biased answer. So.
Yeah. No.
No.
No. I'll swear that I'm going to not be biased.
No, opinions are biased.
Right.
Are we at a time where voting should become nationally overseen? Essentially, take the best ideas that might be around, like Oregon's automatic voter registration law, things like that.
Right.
And basically acknowledge that even this morning, for at least the issue of all the hacking that took place with Georgia voting booths in 2014 that might have contributed malfeasance there. But essentially, are we at a crisis point where either party, presumably the Democratic Party, because they're putting more invested time into it, could state that this is now a national crisis that requires a national response?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that certainly should be on the table. It's hard to know how politically feasible something like that is. I mean, the Supreme Court would probably, rule something like that unconstitutional. I mean, their kind of decision on the Voting Rights Act is an indication of that. But that's something that we've been fighting about in the United States from the very beginning. I mean, voting and how who got to vote, how they got to vote. Those were all rights that were given to the states. I mean, how many of you think we have a constitutional right to vote? And a U.S. that the U.S. Constitution guarantees us the right to vote. Do we have a constitutional right to vote in this country? No. I mean, we have a constitutional right not to be discriminated against when we vote, as opposed. But there's no. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Constitution. Voting. So I mean, in effect, you would have to do something like that. You'd have to really pass a constitutional amendment, or I would think you would, that made a principle of the federal Constitution that every citizen in the United States had a right to vote in all these different elections, and that the states and municipalities actually had to conform in some particular ways to to whatever standards were set up. Right now, it's even more like that. But the court, I mean, in this particular case, the courts are saying that, to the extent that they can prove racial bias and racial intent, then they can rule these laws unconstitutional, and that's what they've done in the case of North Carolina. And right now, that's all, the 15th Amendment's about all we got. We've got to try to uphold that.
So we've got about 1 minute left, and I guess in the last maybe 30 seconds of that 1 minute, I wonder if I can take the final question, and it's a very fast one. So one of the objectives of Fresh Take Fridays is to rock everyone's world, and I feel like what you just shared with us about not having a constitutional right to vote, that might have been it. But is there anything that you've encountered in doing this work, like a shocking behind-the-scenes, like true Hollywood story that you can share with us that stays in this room, like we will never tell, it's like Vegas, that you can share with us?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I don't know if I have any. I mean, I guess that. I guess I can't overstate how serious all these issues are, and how important it is, particularly in a university environment like that, to make our students aware of the importance of voting, the importance of participating in the political process, the importance of educating themselves about this. I mean, because there are plenty of people in this country who are doing everything they can to try to, dissuade people from voting, to discourage people from thinking that, that they have rights and obligations as citizens, to confuse them with all kinds of other thinking and of other ways of thinking. So, I guess that I think the point is that these issues are, for this nation, for the democracy that we live in. This is really, I would restate what I said before. This is probably as critical time as we've had in this country since the Civil War, since the end of the Civil War. And given what's happened in the last, in the years since the Civil War, so what's that, almost 150 years, or maybe more than 150 years, I think that puts us in a kind of crisis moment. And that we need to be spending more time worrying about that than who's going to win the Oscar this year. So, anyway.
Critical for what? Critical for democracy?
Yeah, and critical for our future, our plan. I mean, it's like, the battle about climate change is going to be is a political battle. Okay. I mean, it's not about science. It's about politics and political power and who exercises that. And if you're interested in not seeing another 1,000 species become extinct, and never, I don't know how often it's happened, or you think you want to have a future for yourself and your children and grandchildren, then I mean, it's really great to know all the science, but the fight over climate is going to be in the political arena, both in the United States and other places in the world. Okay, thank y'all all for coming in on Friday morning.
So we hope you'll join us for the next Fresh Take Friday on Friday, February 21st. So next month, 9 a.m. and we'll give you more information about the location. We'll have UNC professors Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler to talk about political deadlock, ideology, political psychology, and other themes from their amazing book, Prius or Pickup. So please, we think there's still food outside. Please help yourself to seconds and thirds and fourths, if you will. And we hope you'll stay involved with Polis. Have a wonderful weekend.
Can I say one thing
Oh,
too?
yes.
This is also, if you, we'd love to have this series continue, and it's so helpful if anyone has any like fresh take on what happened here this Friday. If you could email any member of the Polis team with a reaction, it's so useful for us in our promotions, in our annual report, et cetera. We don't take attendance, at least at this point, but it would just be awesome if we got some emails. Thanks.